The 5th of June, 1944, 4:15 a.m. Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The most powerful man in the Allied military sat in a sparse meeting room, listening to a weather forecast that could kill 160,000 men. Rain hammered against the windows. Wind howled through the English Channel just miles away. Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the chief meteorologist, stood before him with charts showing storm fronts advancing from the Atlantic. "Gentlemen," Stagg said, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was about to recommend, "conditions will worsen significantly over the next 48 hours. Heavy clouds, force 6 winds, rough seas." Eisenhower sat motionless. His face revealed nothing. Around him, the most experienced military commanders in the Allied forces waited for his reaction. Montgomery, Bradley, Tedder, Lee Mallory. They'd already postponed the invasion once, pulling ships back from the Channel just hours before they were supposed to land. The problem wasn't just the weather, it was time. June 5, 6, and 7 were the only dates in weeks when the moon would be bright enough for paratroopers, and the tides would be low enough to expose German beach obstacles. If they didn't go now, the next window wasn't until June 19, 2 full weeks of keeping the invasion secret, while 3 million pieces of equipment and 160,000 troops sat in ports and camps across southern England. Eisenhower looked at each of his commanders. Then he spoke 4 words that would change history. "Okay, we'll go." But that wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Because what happened in Eisenhower's mind over the next 24 hours reveals something about leadership that historians rarely discuss: the psychological burden of sending men to die and the private preparation for accepting total in time responsibility if it all went wrong. If you want to see what actually went through the mind of the man who ordered D-Day and the note he wrote that he hoped never to release, hit subscribe right now. The weight no one else could carry. Understanding what Eisenhower faced on the 5th of June, 1944, requires understanding what made the D-Day decision different from every other military decision in history up to that point. This wasn't just large, it wasn't just complex, it was unprecedented. The invasion fleet included 6,939 vessels. The assault force, 156,000 men in the first wave alone. Over 11,000 aircraft. The logistics planning involved coordinating American, British, Canadian, French, and Polish forces, each with their own command structures, communication systems, and national priorities. And all of it depended on weather that couldn't be reliably predicted. In his own words, Eisenhower later wrote, "I don't like it, but we have to go." That simple statement hides layers of calculation that historians have spent decades trying to unpack. Here's what Eisenhower knew on the evening of June 5. The weather forecast was marginal at best. Stagg had predicted a temporary break in the storm, maybe 36 hours of barely acceptable conditions. Not good conditions. Acceptable? After that, the weather would deteriorate again. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory had submitted a written recommendation that the American airborne phase be canceled entirely. He predicted that 70% of the gliders and 50% of the parachute aircraft would be shot down by German anti-aircraft fire. Casualties could exceed 50% before the men even reached the ground. The German defenses along the French coast had been strengthened for 4 years. Rommel himself had spent months reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. Millions of mines, steel obstacles on the beaches, interlocking fields of fire from concrete bunkers, elite German divisions positioned to counterattack. Churchill, Britain's prime minister, had privately expressed doubts about whether Overlord would succeed. He'd seen too many amphibious assaults fail catastrophically. Gallipoli in World War I haunted British strategic thinking. He'd agreed to Overlord reluctantly, under pressure from Roosevelt and Stalin. What I find most significant about Eisenhower's position is that he couldn't share his doubts with anyone. The commanders around him needed confidence from their supreme commander. The troops preparing to cross the Channel needed to believe in victory. Political leaders back in Washington and London needed assurance that their strategic gamble would succeed. Eisenhower had to project certainty while drowning in uncertainty. That afternoon, after giving the final go-ahead, Eisenhower returned to his quarters at Telegraph Cottage in Kingston on Thames. His driver and secretary, Kay Summersby, later recalled that he confided to her, "I hope to God I'm right." It was the only moment of doubt he allowed himself to express to another person. What he did next reveals the depth of his psychological preparation for failure. Alone in his cottage, with the roar of aircraft overhead carrying paratroopers toward France, Eisenhower took out a piece of paper and handwrote a brief message. It read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." 66 words. One paragraph. No excuses. No hedging. No attempt to spread responsibility. What stands out about this note, what makes it one of the most remarkable documents of World War II, isn't just what it says, but what Eisenhower crossed out while writing it. The original draft said this particular operation failed. Eisenhower crossed that out and wrote, "My decision to attack." He changed passive observation to personal responsibility. The original said the troops could do. Eisenhower underlined, "could do," emphasizing that failure wouldn't be their fault. And then he drew a long, thick line under the words, "mine alone." Not once, twice. You can see it in the original document, now preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library. That underlining reveals a man who was psychologically preparing to accept total blame for a catastrophic failure. Here's what makes this even more revealing. Eisenhower actually dated the note July 5 instead of June 5. He was so preoccupied, so focused on the weight of the decision he'd made, that he got the month wrong. After writing the note, Eisenhower folded it and put it in his pocket. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, saw him discard it later and retrieved it. That's the only reason we have it today. Eisenhower intended it to be a private document for release only if D-Day failed catastrophically. Think about what that means. While his public message to the troops was confident and inspiring, "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade," his private preparation was for total failure and public humiliation. This dual preparation reveals something crucial about leadership at the strategic level. You can't show doubt publicly, but you also can't ignore the possibility of failure privately. Eisenhower managed both simultaneously. What I find most striking is that Eisenhower later told a subordinate he'd written similar notes before every major amphibious operation he'd commanded. This wasn't a one-time gesture. It was a ritual, a way of forcing himself to accept the full weight of responsibility before ordering men into combat. That evening, around 8:30 p.m., Eisenhower left his headquarters and drove to the 101st Airborne Division's departure airfield near Newbury. The photos from that visit are some of the most iconic images of World War II. Eisenhower moving among young paratroopers, their faces already blackened with camouflage paint, talking casually about where they were from and what they did back home. What the photos don't capture is what Eisenhower was thinking during that visit. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, he recalled, "I found the men in fine fettle, many of them joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry, since the 101st was on the job, and everything would be taken care of in fine shape." That's the public memory. Young soldiers reassuring their commanding general. Confidence, bravado, the American fighting spirit. But Eisenhower's private thoughts were darker. He knew Lee Mallory's casualty predictions. He knew these young men, many of them teenagers who'd never been in combat, were about to jump into darkness over heavily defended enemy territory. He knew that a significant percentage of them wouldn't survive the night. One exchange captured by witnesses shows the complexity of that moment. A paratrooper from Michigan asked Eisenhower if he was from Kansas. Eisenhower confirmed he was. The soldier grinned and said, "Well, General, we're from Kansas too. We'll take care of things for you." Eisenhower smiled and chatted with the young man for a few minutes. After he moved on, one of his aides noticed the general's hands were shaking. This is the dimension of command that never makes it into official histories. The personal cost of sending men to die. Eisenhower couldn't show the soldiers his fear they needed to see confidence. But he couldn't escape the knowledge that he was ordering many of them to their deaths. He stayed at the airfield until past midnight, watching plane after plane take off into the darkness. Then he drove the 2 hours back to headquarters and waited for the first reports. What surprised me most while researching this period was discovering how completely isolated Eisenhower was in those hours. His commanders were focused on their own sectors. His staff was managing logistics and communications. The troops were already in motion. Eisenhower was the only person in the entire invasion force whose job was to carry the responsibility for all of it simultaneously. Modern military doctrine talks about mission command, giving subordinates clear objectives and letting them determine methods. But D-Day required the opposite. It required one man to make a decision that would affect millions of people based on imperfect information, with no ability to change course once the operation began. That's a level of responsibility that's almost impossible to comprehend, and Eisenhower carried it alone. While Eisenhower was visiting the 101st Airborne, German commanders were making their own weather-based decisions. But the contrast between Eisenhower's approach and the German High Command's response reveals why the Allies won the war. German meteorologists had access to far less weather data than the Allies. They lacked weather stations in the Atlantic. Their forecasts were based primarily on observations from Europe and limited naval patrols. Their prediction: storms would continue through mid-June. The weather was so bad that an Allied invasion was impossible. Based on this assessment, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of German Army Group B defending Normandy, left for Germany on June 4 to celebrate his wife's birthday. Other German commanders stood down from high alert. The Kriegsmarine canceled its nightly patrol and min-laying operations in the Channel for the night of June 5 to 6. This German confidence that the weather made invasion impossible was exactly what Eisenhower had bet on. The marginal conditions that Stagg predicted would provide just enough of a window for the Allies meant the Germans would be unprepared. But here's where the command philosophy difference becomes crucial. When German commanders realized they'd miscalculated and the invasion was underway, their response was constrained by Hitler's centralized control. The German 21st Panzer Division was positioned close enough to counterattack the beaches within hours, but German doctrine required Hitler's personal approval to deploy armored reserves. And Hitler was asleep in Berchtesgaden, hundreds of miles away. His staff refused to wake him. By the time Hitler was awake and gave permission to deploy the panzers after midday on June 6, the moment for a decisive counterattack had passed. Allied forces had established enough of a foothold that German armored units couldn't dislodge them. The contrast is stark. Eisenhower made a decision based on marginal weather information and accepted full responsibility for the consequences. The German command structure was so centralized that local commanders couldn't respond to changing conditions without approval from Berlin. What I find most significant about this comparison is that it wasn't a question of German commanders being less competent or less brave. It was a structural problem with how command authority was distributed. Eisenhower had spent months building a command team he trusted. When he made the final go decision, he empowered Montgomery to command ground forces, Tedder to command air forces, and Ramsey to command naval forces. Each knew their objectives and had authority to adjust tactics as conditions changed. The German system concentrated all decision-making authority in Hitler personally, and Hitler, despite his many speeches about willpower and determination, wasn't at his command post when the invasion began. He was in Bavaria, asleep, and his staff was too afraid to wake him. This reveals something crucial about strategic leadership. Your command philosophy before the crisis determines what's possible during the crisis. Eisenhower's willingness to delegate authority and trust his subordinates' judgment made the invasion succeed despite marginal weather and high casualties in some sectors. The German inability to respond quickly was a direct result of Hitler's refusal to trust anyone else's judgment. The first message Eisenhower received about the actual landings came around 7:30 a.m. British time. The code word "top flight" confirmed that American forces had begun landing at Utah and Omaha beaches. But landing didn't mean success. The reports were fragmentary. Radio communications were disrupted by the weather and German jamming. What Eisenhower knew was that troops were ashore. What he didn't know was whether they'd established a viable beachhead or were being pushed back into the sea. The airborne operations, the ones Lee Mallory had predicted would suffer 50–70% casualties, had been chaotic. Paratroopers were scattered across the Norman countryside, many miles from their designated drop zones. Gliders had crashed in flooded fields, drowning men who couldn't escape their harnesses underwater. But the reports also indicated that American and British airborne forces had achieved their primary objectives: securing bridges, capturing key road junctions, and creating confusion in the German rear areas. By mid-morning, reports from Omaha Beach were catastrophic. American forces had encountered unexpectedly strong German resistance. Casualties were mounting. Landing craft were burning. Some units had been pinned down at the waterline and couldn't advance off the beach. This was Eisenhower's nightmare scenario, not total failure, but partial success that would require deciding whether to reinforce struggling sectors or cut losses and withdraw. What stands out about Eisenhower's response is what he didn't do. He didn't micromanage. He didn't override his ground commanders. He didn't panic. He waited. He read reports. He asked clarifying questions. But he trusted Bradley and Montgomery to manage the tactical situation while he maintained strategic perspective. By afternoon, the situation was clarifying. Omaha Beach, despite horrific casualties, had been secured. Utah Beach landings were ahead of schedule. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches had established solid beachheads. The invasion hadn't gone according to plan. It never does, but it had succeeded. Allied forces were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. Eisenhower didn't celebrate. According to witnesses, his primary emotion was relief mixed with grief. Relief that the invasion had succeeded. Grief for the thousands of men who died making it succeed. The "in case of failure" note stayed in his pocket, then later in his wallet, then eventually in the National Archives, a reminder of the responsibility he'd been prepared to accept. The standard narrative of D-Day focuses on the courage of the soldiers who stormed the beaches. And rightfully so, their bravery was extraordinary. But what gets less attention is the different kind of courage required to make the decision to send them in the first place. Eisenhower faced a decision where every option had catastrophic consequences. Go ahead with marginal weather and risk failure that could cost 50,000 plus casualties and delay the war by a year or more. Postpone again and risk losing the element of surprise while German intelligence learned the invasion plans. Cancel entirely and abandon the strategic plan to liberate Europe from the West. None of these were good options. All involved accepting enormous risks and potential costs. What separates adequate leaders from great ones is the ability to make decisions in situations where all options are bad and you still have to choose. Eisenhower made that choice and then spent the next 24 hours living with the knowledge that he might have just ordered a catastrophic failure. The "in case of failure" note reveals something crucial about how he processed that burden. He didn't try to distribute blame or prepare excuses. He didn't hedge or create political cover. He prepared to accept total, public responsibility for failure. This is rare. It's human nature to prepare excuses, to identify scapegoats, to spread responsibility so that failure doesn't land entirely on your shoulders. Eisenhower did the opposite. He concentrated all potential blame on himself, while distributing all potential credit to the troops, air forces, and navy who executed the operation. Compare this to how modern leaders handle major decisions. How often do you see leaders prepare public statements accepting full blame for potential failures before those failures occur? How often do leaders volunteer to be the sole scapegoat if things go wrong? It almost never happens, because the political cost is too high, because modern media culture punishes admission of doubt or uncertainty, because career survival often depends on maintaining the appearance of infallibility. Eisenhower understood that leadership at the strategic level requires accepting asymmetric responsibility. You get less credit for success than your subordinates, and you accept more blame for failure. That's not fair, but it's necessary for maintaining trust and cohesion in large organizations facing existential threats. On June 6, 1944, at approximately 3:00 p.m., when it became clear that D-Day had succeeded, Eisenhower finally allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He later wrote that he felt the burden of years lift from his shoulders. But that burden never entirely lifted. For the rest of his life, Eisenhower carried the memory of ordering men to their deaths. In his Guildhall address in London a year later, after victory in Europe, he said something that reveals how deeply that weight affected him. Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in the blood of his followers and the sacrifices of his friends. That's not false modesty. That's the voice of a man who understands the true cost of command. The D-Day decision reveals something about leadership that's uncomfortable to acknowledge. Sometimes, the right decision is the one that accepts enormous costs because the alternatives are worse. Sometimes, leadership means carrying psychological burdens that would break most people. Sometimes, responsibility means preparing to accept total blame for failure while giving all credit for success to others. Eisenhower's mind on the eve of D-Day wasn't filled with heroic confidence or certainty of victory. It was filled with calculation of acceptable losses, preparation for catastrophic failure, and acceptance of total responsibility regardless of outcome. That's not the story we tell about D-Day. We prefer the narrative of confident commanders and brave soldiers marching inevitably to victory. But the reality was more complex and more human, a man making the best decision he could with imperfect information, then waiting through agonizing hours to learn whether he'd just ordered a triumph or a tragedy. The fact that D-Day succeeded doesn't make Eisenhower's burden lighter. It just means he didn't have to release the note he'd prepared, but he wrote it, he carried it, and he was prepared to own total failure if that's what happened. That's leadership at its most demanding and its most honest. Do you think modern leaders could handle the level of responsibility Eisenhower accepted? Should they be expected to? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about the hidden psychological burdens of historical leadership decisions, subscribe now.